As forwarding service engineer at Ericsson Canada for 5 years. In his spare time, he works on writing and, and making independent films. That's cool. Intel Dynamic LNET Configuration. Amir.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about LNET Dynamic Config, DLC for short. All right, so just to give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about, first I'll just highlight the purpose of LNET, what it can do, what it cannot do, just go over the parameters that it configures and how we can configure it, and then talk about an API that we added so that you can it enables people to configure LNET programmatically rather than through utility. So basically the purpose for LNET is fairly simple. LNET right now only configures, or is only configured through module parameters, so you have to add a whole bunch of module parameters in the module parameter file and restart LNET for those changes to take effect. It would be nice to be able to dynamically configure it so that you don't have to keep restarting LNET if you're going through a fine-tuning process. The changes allows you to configure LNET completely while the system is running. You don't have to bring it down at all. Okay, so what can it do? Basically, what we're able to add, delete, and show networks. I forgot to put show here, but you can show configured networks or add new networks, or you delete existing networks. Same with routes. You can configure the router buffer pools all on the fly. You can enable, disable routing, and you can show the routing information. And then we added also the ability that you can describe a bunch of configuration as YAML, in a YAML file in YAML format, and then you can import it so that you can configure it all at once, or you can export the current configuration in YAML format. We chose a specific set of parameters to configure. It's not exhaustive, so there are parameters that are not configured via DLC right now. Examples of that are like map on demand or check routes before use, etc. But for the first iteration of DLC, we chose the most used parameters. There are two ways to configure LNET or to configure parameters for DLC. You can configure it through a new tool, command line tool called LNET control, or you can configure it through the C API programmatically. You can write your own tool to call the API directly. So here's a quick block diagram to show how all the bits and pieces fit together. At the top, you have your startup scripts, your shell scripts. They can call LNET control on the right-hand side. And the LNET control uses the LNET Config library API as its infrastructure. Also, other tools can use the library, like for example, our IML tool can use it, or another third-party tool can use it. The API exposes two different classes of APIs. One is to configure specific parameters like a network or a route, and another one to exposes a YAML interface so you can feed it a file, a YAML file to configure all parameters described there. And it talks to LNET control over IO control. Sorry, LNET kernel module over IO control. Okay, so now I'm going to just go quickly over the different commands. I'm not going to spend too much time because it's kind of boring to look at this. But basically, what we can do is we can add a network. You can specify the network name like TCP0 or IB or an IB interface. You can specify the interface that it associated with this network, Ethernet 0, for example, and then you can define a set of different parameters which are optional to configure the network. Previously, peer time or peer credits were for all networks. Now they are specific to the network you're creating. And as an example, you can see how you can add it, like LNET control, net add, -- net, and so on and so forth. You can remove the networks by specifying the network that you want to delete, as shown. The other thing is you can show networks. This is kind of new. You can show the different sets, all the networks that are configured, or you can show one specific network, or you can show a specific network, and there's a detailed keyword which allows you to specify a detailed output, or if you don't specify it, it gives you a summarized output. Now, all show output comes out in YAML format. We decided to standardize on that in Lustre. So here's an example of detailed output for when you show a network. It shows you the network, its NID, the status, and the tunables. Tunable section is the part of the detailed output, so if you don't specify the detailed output, it doesn't display that part. For routes, pretty much the same thing. You can add the routes. There are mandatory and optional parameters. NET and gateway are mandatory, hop and priority are optional. You can specify, this is how you add it. You can remove it pretty much the same way. You can say route del, and you specify the NET and gateway so that you can uniquely identify that route that you want to delete. And you can also show, when you show, the other thing here is you can use those parameters to filter. So say you want to show all parameters with a specific net or gateway or a hop or whatever, you can specify those parameters and it will filter on the output on that field that you specified. This, for example, shows a specific network, specific route. Again, all output is in YAML format, as you can see. And the detailed part, when you specify detailed keyword, it displays hop priority and state. Without the detail, it just specifies the net and gateway. Just want to talk quickly about configure buffer pools, just to describe the behavior when you configure a buffer pool. When you set a specific, like one of the value for the tiny, small, or large buffers, if you don't have routing enabled at this point, what happens is the values get stored, and when you enable routing, the values get picked up automatically. If you disable and enable routing, it doesn't lose, it doesn't reset the values. It maintains whatever value that you had specified previously. You can also enable and disable routing on the fly. You don't have to do anything. You just, I'll show you how it's done. But if you have a node which is router and you want to reuse that node for any other purpose, you can just turn off routing and you can start using it for something else. And there are ranges. There's an acceptable range for the sizes. So if you go beyond that range, it just defaults to a specific, to the default value that's in the code. So here's how you set, fairly simple. You can just set tiny buffers or set small buffers or large buffers. And here's how you set the routing. You enable or disable routing by, again, set routing 0 for disable or 1 for enable. And you can show the output, the show routing information. So it dumps all the information about the buffers. So this is good for, I'll show you, there's a scenario that it's good for. I'll talk about it later. The other thing now is, say you have a set of configuration that you want to configure all at once. You can write that, describe that in a YAML file, then you can import it. By default, the import command assumes that you want to configure all the elements that you specified in the file, but you can override that by saying import, and you specify --del, or if you want to show them, you say --show. And here are some examples. You can import or delete or show. The reverse is also possible. So say you configured a node and you want to be able to persistently hold the configuration in some file, and then on reset of the node you want to be able to reconfigure the node. You can export the configuration, dump it into a file, and then after that re-import it once the node comes up through a script, for example. Here's an example of a YAML file. This one describes one net, one route. Yes, or two routes. No, one route. No, two routes, sorry. One net, two routes, and the buffer. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about the configuration API. So this it's a C API. It exposes two classes of two classes of APIs, like I mentioned before, one that configures a specific parameter and one that takes a YAML file. Said that. Okay. The kind of cool thing that you can do, well, all right, so the API, any output from that API is in YAML format. It's described in a C structure, but it returns to you a C block that describes a YAML output, and then you can store that YAML output, you can print it, you can search it programmatically or whatever. The other thing you can do is you can wrap that C API, for example, in a Python file, in a Python through Swig in Python, and then that becomes callable from third-party or interpreted language like Python. For example, what I did as just a test I was doing, you can create a Swig wrapper for the C library, and then you can compile it using Swig, and then it will create that lusterconf API, for example, module. That's a Python module. You can just import it in Python, and then you can start calling the APIs. It's good for, I used it to test my changes, for example. And it was good because then you can write a whole bunch of Python scripts using this, and then you can run it multiple times. This is, okay. The last thing I'd like to talk about is the fact that those, the output from the show API or from when you export the API is directly importable. So it allows for scenarios like, for example, you query a node for its configuration, you store that YAML file, and then you can feed that configuration to when you restart the node, or if you have multiple nodes and you want to configure all the nodes exactly the same, you can just use that file to configure all nodes. So that, in a nutshell, is DLC. Any questions? Cool.
Hi. Is there any difference when you have to set the peer buffer credits for the dynamic for this dynamic LNET config?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I couldn't hear any difference to it.
The peer buffer credits on LNET routers, for example, and the buffer credits. So those are options that LNET offers.
Yeah.
Is there any difference dynamically changing those in your design?
Any difference when you dynamically configure the outer buffer pools?
I suppose, can you do it?
Like it will behave exactly the same as if you configured it from module parameters.
Yeah.
If you, for example, add extra buffers,
yep,
right away the buffers are added for you. If you delete the buffers or reduce the amount of buffers, what happens is it declares the buffers to be freed whenever they're returned from use. So if a buffer is in use and then you return and it sees that the number of allocated buffers should be less, so it just disregards that buffer.
So the credits are required across the whole cluster in order to make that change, though, rather than a node by node change.
Well, right now DLC works only on node by node, so you have to make the change per node.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thanks.
If it does affect multiple nodes, you'll have to do that.
Do you have plans in the future to expand this to address more other dynamic features of configuring routing, like if you add interfaces, if one fails, addressing IB bonding, things like that?
It will be nice, but it's not my call to say whether we have plans or not. So I don't know.
Is there an architectural reason you chose to create a new separate command, LNET control, as opposed to making it a sub-option off of L control?
Well, we thought because LNET is a separate module almost used separately, so we wanted to have an LNET, a utility that's specific to LNET rather than just expand L control for more. And then we can address some of the usability so that it's more consistent across all the commands.
So then will you remove the options from Lustre control to add and remove routes and things like that?
We should.
That's a design point. You should do that.
All right. We'll add it on our list of to-dos.
Do you have a utility that takes the MyProbe comps that we have today and turn them into YAML files?
No, we don't.
Oh, you realize that some of our configs can be quite monsters.
Yeah. It shouldn't be too hard because you're just reading a thing and then you're rewriting it into YAML file. Again, it's not my call to say what should be added on the project or not, but.
Okay, so it's still backwards compatible. The old mod probe config.
Oh yeah, you can still configure mod, like we didn't cancel mod probe, right? It's still, you can configure it, but then this is the new way, and if you want to configure things dynamically, you can.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
Since it's just routes, I'm assuming it works with fine-grained routing and being able to change routes for fine-grained routing.
Sorry, say the question, I couldn't hear you.
Lustre and Oak Ridge has been doing what they call fine-grained routing, where it breaks things up in like little chunks, yeah.
Yeah, it just adds any type of routes that you'd like.